What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family vacations. The Torres family went to Maine for Christmas, 1995. They never came back. What was found 11 years later still haunts every resident in that small town. Subscribe now, because this case will change how you see missing person investigations forever. Hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, have you ever had a vacation that felt wrong? Keep watching, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. I've investigated missing persons cases for over 2 decades, but the Torres family disappearance in Millfield, Maine, remains the most disturbing case I've ever encountered. Even now, as I write this, my hands shake slightly when I think about what we discovered 11 years after they vanished without a trace. It was December 23, 1995, when Miguel and Carmen Torres packed their burgundy Suburban with Christmas presents, winter clothes, and enough food for a week-long retreat. Their children, Sofia, aged 12, and little Mateo, barely 8, bounced excitedly in the back seat as they drove the winding roads toward their rented cabin in the Pine Ridge area of Maine. The family had been planning this Christmas getaway for months, eager to escape the noise and stress of their busy life in Boston. I remember studying the photographs the family had taken during their journey. Carmen's smile was radiant as she posed next to a roadside diner, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight. Miguel looked relaxed for the first time in years, his architect's stress lines softened by the promise of a peaceful holiday. The children were captured mid-laugh, building a small snowman outside a gas station where they'd stopped for hot chocolate and snacks. The cabin they'd rented belonged to Harold Whitmore, a 73-year-old retiree who'd been renting the property to city families for over 15 years. Harold later told me that the Torres family seemed perfectly normal when they arrived that evening. He'd helped them carry their luggage inside, shown them how to work the old wood-burning stove, and explained where to find extra firewood behind the cabin. The property sat on 12 acres of dense woodland, with the nearest neighbor almost 2 miles away through thick pine forest. What struck me most about Harold's testimony was his description of the family's mood that first night. They were tired from the drive, but genuinely excited about their vacation. Carmen had asked about local hiking trails, while Miguel inquired about the best spots for sledding with the kids. Sofia and Mateo had immediately claimed the cabin's loft bedroom, their laughter echoing through the wooden structure as they explored their temporary home. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, hardwood floors, and large windows that offered stunning views of the surrounding forest. Built in the 1940s, it had been modernized just enough to include indoor plumbing and electricity, but it retained the charm of an authentic Maine wilderness retreat. The kitchen was small but functional, perfect for preparing simple family meals. 2 bedrooms occupied the main floor, while the loft served as a cozy space where children could feel like they were camping indoors. Harold's property records showed that the Torres family had paid for a full week's stay, from December 23rd through December 30th. They'd left a deposit and seemed financially stable, with no apparent reason to flee or disappear voluntarily. Miguel worked as a successful architect in Boston, while Carmen taught elementary school. They owned their home, had stable jobs, and by all accounts, enjoyed a happy marriage. The last confirmed sighting of the family occurred at approximately 6:30 p.m. on December 23rd, when Harold saw smoke rising from the cabin's chimney as he drove past on his way to town. He'd waved at the warm yellow glow emanating from the windows, satisfied that his tenants were settling in comfortably for their holiday stay. But that warm, welcoming scene would be the last time anyone saw the Torres family alive. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the most baffling disappearances I've ever investigated. The evidence we eventually uncovered would challenge everything we thought we knew about human nature, family bonds, and the dark secrets that can lurk behind the most innocent facades. As I prepare to take you through this case, I want you to understand that what you're about to hear isn't just another missing person's story. It's a descent into something far more sinister, something that still makes the residents of Millfield lock their doors a little tighter when winter darkness falls across the Maine woods. The Torres family came to Maine seeking peace and holiday joy. What they found instead was something that would haunt an entire community for over a decade, until the truth finally emerged from the most unexpected place imaginable. The first sign that something was wrong came on December 26th, when Harold Whitmore drove by the cabin to check on his tenants. The Torres family's Suburban sat in the driveway, exactly where they'd parked it 3 days earlier, but no smoke rose from the chimney. The windows were dark, and an unsettling stillness hung over the property like a shroud. Harold knocked on the cabin door, calling out friendly greetings, but received no response. He tried the handle and found it unlocked, which immediately raised his suspicions. City families were usually paranoid about security, even in rural Maine. He stepped inside and called out again, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. What he found inside the cabin would puzzle investigators for years to come. The family's belongings were scattered throughout the space as if they'd been living there normally. Carmen's book lay open on the kitchen table, a bookmark placed halfway through Chapter 7. Sophia's sketchpad contained detailed drawings of pine trees and snow-covered landscapes, the pencil still sharp and ready for use. Mateo's collection of toy cars was arranged in a precise line along the fireplace hearth. The beds had been slept in but not made. Dirty dishes sat in the kitchen sink, and the refrigerator still contained the groceries the family had brought from Boston. Miguel's camera sat on the coffee table, its film still inside, waiting to be developed. Most puzzling of all, their suitcases remained in the bedrooms, clothes neatly folded and hanging in the small closet. Harold immediately contacted the Millfield Sheriff's Department, and within an hour, Deputy Sarah Chen arrived to conduct a preliminary investigation. Sarah, whom I later interviewed extensively, described the scene as lived in but abandoned, as if the family had simply stepped outside for a walk and never returned. The investigation began in earnest the following day. Sheriff Tom Rodriguez assembled a search team that included state police, local volunteers, and a K-9 unit from Portland. They combed through the 12 acres surrounding the cabin, looking for any sign of the Torres family or clues about their disappearance. What the searchers found only deepened the mystery. About 300 yards from the cabin, they discovered a set of footprints in the snow that matched the family's shoe sizes. The tracks led from the cabin toward a dense grove of pine trees, but after approximately 50 yards, they simply stopped. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, nothing to indicate what might have happened to 4 people who seemed to have vanished into thin air. The K-9 units picked up the family's scent along the same path, but like the footprints, the trail went cold at the exact same spot. The dogs circled the area repeatedly, whining and pawing at the snow, but they couldn't follow the scent any further. It was as if the Torres family had been lifted straight up into the sky. Sheriff Rodriguez expanded the search radius to 5 miles, bringing in additional volunteers and even a helicopter from the state police. They searched abandoned buildings, old mine shafts, frozen ponds, and every conceivable hiding place in the area. Local hunters who knew the terrain like the back of their hands volunteered their time, certain they could find something the official searchers had missed. But after 2 weeks of intensive searching, the investigation had yielded nothing. The Torres family had simply vanished, leaving behind a cabin full of their possessions and a community full of questions. The case attracted media attention from across New England, with reporters dubbing it the Christmas miracle disappearance, though there was nothing miraculous about 4 people vanishing without explanation. The family's relatives from Boston arrived within days of the disappearance, Carmen's sister Maria broke down when she saw the untouched Christmas presents still wrapped under the small tree the family had decorated. Miguel's elderly parents flew in from Puerto Rico, refusing to believe their son and his family were truly gone. They hired a private investigator and offered a reward for any information leading to the family's whereabouts. As winter turned to spring, the search efforts gradually diminished. The official investigation remained open, but with no new leads or evidence, Sheriff Rodriguez and his team had little choice but to focus their resources on other cases. The cabin sat empty for months, too eerie for Harold to rent to other families, too painful for him to enter himself. The Torres case became local legend, the kind of story that parents used to keep their children from wandering too far into the woods. Some residents speculated about cult activity. Others suggested the family had fled to escape some unknown danger. A few whispered about supernatural explanations, though most dismissed such talk as small-town superstition. But I knew there had to be a logical explanation for what happened to the Torres family. In my experience, people don't simply disappear without leaving some trace of their fate. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered. I just never imagined it would take 11 years to find it, or that when we finally did, it would be so much worse than anything we'd imagined. By the summer of 1996, the Torres family disappearance had faded from the headlines, but it never left the minds of Millfield's residents. I interviewed dozens of locals during my investigation, and they all described the same unsettling feeling that had settled over their community. Children who used to play freely in the woods now stayed closer to home. Adults found themselves checking and double-checking their door locks at night. Harold Whitmore struggled with guilt and paranoia for months after the disappearance. He questioned every decision he'd made, wondering if he should have checked on the family sooner, if he'd missed some warning sign that could have prevented whatever tragedy had befallen them. He stopped renting the cabin altogether, unable to bear the thought of another family meeting the same mysterious fate. The official investigation continued sporadically throughout 1996 and into 1997. Sheriff Rodriguez followed up on every tip, no matter how far-fetched. A psychic from California claimed the family had been abducted by aliens. A conspiracy theorist insisted they'd uncovered government secrets and been eliminated. A vagrant reported seeing 4 people matching the Torres family's description hitchhiking on a highway in Vermont, but the lead went nowhere. What troubled me most about the case file was the absence of any logical motive for the family's disappearance. The Torres family had no known enemies, no financial troubles, no marital problems. Miguel's architectural firm confirmed he'd been a valued employee with no workplace conflicts. Carmen's school principal described her as beloved by students and colleagues alike. There was no evidence of drug use, gambling debts, or any other issues that might drive a family to disappear voluntarily. The FBI became involved in early 1997, treating the case as a potential kidnapping. Agent Patricia Moore, whom I later consulted on the case, told me that the Torres disappearance exhibited patterns unlike any kidnapping she'd encountered. Kidnappers typically leave ransom demands, evidence of struggle, or some indication of their motives. The Torres case had none of these elements. Agent Moore's team conducted extensive background checks on everyone who'd had contact with the family before their disappearance. They investigated Harold Whitmore, the gas station attendants who'd served them during their journey, even the restaurant staff who'd prepared their last confirmed meal at a diner in Bangor. Every lead led to dead ends. The family's financial records revealed nothing suspicious. Their bank accounts remained untouched after the disappearance. Credit cards showed no activity beyond their trip to Maine. Miguel's business accounts were in order, and Carmen's modest teacher's salary was being direct deposited into an account that nobody ever accessed. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, the media attention briefly resurged. News crews returned to Millfield, interviewing residents who'd grown tired of telling the same story repeatedly. Some locals refused to speak to reporters, feeling exploited by the media circus that had descended on their quiet town. But new information did emerge during this renewed interest. A truck driver named Dennis Walsh came forward with a story he'd been too embarrassed to tell the previous year. On the night of December 24th, 1995, he'd been driving through the Pine Ridge area when he saw strange lights in the forest. Not the warm glow of cabin windows, but something else entirely. Bright, pulsing lights that seemed to move through the trees. Walsh had dismissed the sighting as his imagination, possibly influenced by the Christmas beer he'd consumed earlier that evening. But as the Torres case gained national attention, he began to wonder if what he'd seen might be connected to the family's disappearance. Sheriff Rodriguez interviewed Walsh extensively, but the trucker's account was too vague and alcohol-influenced to provide meaningful leads. Other residents began sharing their own strange experiences from that winter. Margaret Kozlowski, who lived about 5 miles from the cabin, reported hearing unusual sounds in the woods during late December 1995. Not quite animal noises, but not entirely human either. She described them as calls or signals, as if something in the forest was communicating in a language she couldn't understand. An elderly hunter named Frank Dubois claimed he'd found strange markings on trees near the cabin site several weeks after the disappearance. The marks appeared to be deliberately carved symbols, unlike anything made by natural causes or typical human activity. By the time he led investigators to the location, however, the markings had been obscured by new tree growth and weather damage. These reports, while intriguing, only added to the mystery rather than solving it. Each new piece of information seemed to contradict the others, creating a puzzle that became more complex with every revelation. The Torres family had vanished during what should have been the most wonderful time of the year, leaving behind questions that would haunt Millfield for years to come. As 1997 turned into 1998, the case officially went cold. The sheriff's department kept the file open, but with no new evidence or leads. There was little they could do, except wait for someone to stumble across something that might finally explain what happened to Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and little Mateo Torres on that December night in the Maine woods. The psychological impact of the Torres disappearance on Millfield's residents became more apparent as the years passed. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychologist who'd moved to the area in 1998, noticed an unusual pattern in her patients. Many exhibited symptoms of collective trauma despite having no direct connection to the missing family. Children who'd been the same age as Sofia and Mateo struggled with nightmares about being lost in the woods. Parents became overprotective, reluctant to let their children out of sight even for short periods. The annual Christmas festival, once a joyous community celebration, took on a subdued atmosphere that locals couldn't quite shake. Harold Whitmore's mental health deteriorated significantly during this period. He'd developed agoraphobia and depression, rarely leaving his house except for essential errands. The cabin remained empty, slowly falling into disrepair as Harold couldn't bring himself to maintain a property associated with such tragedy. Ivy began creeping up the walls, and small animals made nests in the eaves. I spoke with Dr. Warren during my investigation, and she described the phenomena as ambient grief, a community-wide mourning process for people they'd never met, but whose fate had somehow become intertwined with their own sense of security. The Torres family represented every parent's worst nightmare, every child's deepest fear of abandonment. By 2000, some residents had begun to adapt to the new reality. The case was mentioned less frequently in casual conversation, though it never truly left public consciousness. New families moved to Millfield, unaware of the area's dark history, until neighbors inevitably shared the story during community gatherings or chance encounters. But for those who'd lived through the initial disappearance and investigation, the Torres case remained an open wound. Sheriff Rodriguez, who'd handled the investigation with professional competence and genuine compassion, found himself questioning his abilities as a law enforcement officer. He'd solved dozens of cases during his career, but his failure to find any trace of the Torres family haunted him. The economic impact was also significant. Tourism, never a major industry in Millfield, declined noticeably as word spread about the unsolved disappearance. The few bed and breakfasts in the area reported cancellations from guests who'd heard about the case and decided to vacation elsewhere. Property values near the Pine Ridge area stagnated, as potential buyers were reluctant to purchase homes in a location associated with such mystery. Local businesses tried to move forward, but the shadow of the Torres case lingered. The diner where the family had eaten their last confirmed meal became a morbid tourist attraction for true crime enthusiasts. The owner eventually changed the restaurant's name and remodeled the interior, hoping to escape the unwanted attention. Harold Whitmore received several offers from television producers and authors who wanted to feature his property in documentaries or books about the disappearance. He refused them all, maintaining his privacy and trying to preserve whatever dignity remained in the situation. The cabin continued to deteriorate, becoming a local symbol of unanswered questions. In 2003, a group of paranormal investigators requested permission to spend a night in the abandoned cabin. Harold initially refused, but eventually agreed when they offered to pay enough money to cover his property taxes for the year. The investigators used various electronic devices to detect supernatural activity, but their overnight stay yielded no meaningful results. The paranormal investigation did, however, attract renewed media attention to the case. A cable television show featured the Torres disappearance in an episode about America's most mysterious missing persons cases. The program presented various theories, but offered no new evidence or insights that might help solve the mystery. As the case approached its 10th anniversary, Sheriff Rodriguez announced his retirement. The Torres investigation had consumed more of his professional energy than any other case, and he admitted privately that his failure to solve it had contributed to his decision to step down. His replacement, Sheriff Linda Hayes, inherited the cold case file along with the community's expectations that somehow, someday, someone would finally discover what happened to the Torres family. The 10th anniversary brought another brief surge of media interest, but by then, many residents had grown weary of the attention. They wanted to remember the Torres family with dignity while moving forward with their own lives. The case had become part of Millfield's identity, but they refused to let it define their entire community. Little did anyone know that the answer to the decade-old mystery was already present in Millfield, waiting in the most unlikely place imaginable. The truth about what happened to Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and Mateo Torres was about to emerge from behind the walls of a house that had stood empty and ignored since before their disappearance, holding secrets that would shake the community to its core. Jennifer Coleman was 28 years old when she bought the old Morrison house on Elm Street in March 2006. The Victorian-era home had been vacant for nearly 15 years, and Jennifer got it for a fraction of its assessed value. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Ruth Morrison, had died in 1991, and her estate had been tied up in legal proceedings ever since. Jennifer was a freelance graphic designer who'd moved to Millfield seeking a quieter lifestyle and lower cost of living. She'd heard about the Torres family disappearance, of course. Everyone in town knew the story, but it didn't factor into her decision to purchase the Morrison property. The house was a good investment, and she was excited about the renovation project ahead of her. The Morrison house stood 2 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and ornate woodwork that had been crafted in the 1880s. Ruth Morrison had been a reclusive woman who'd lived alone for decades, rarely accepting visitors and maintaining minimal contact with her neighbors. After her death, the house had been sealed and left untouched, preserving everything exactly as she'd left it. Jennifer began her renovations with the ground floor, planning to update the kitchen and living areas before tackling the more extensive work needed upstairs. The house's interior was a time capsule of mid-century decor, with floral wallpaper, heavy curtains, and furniture that looked like museum pieces. It was during the third week of renovations that Jennifer made her first disturbing discovery. While removing old wallpaper in the dining room, she found handwritten notes tucked behind the paper near the window. The notes were written in Ruth Morrison's spidery handwriting, but their content was unlike anything Jennifer expected from an elderly woman's private thoughts. The notes contained detailed observations about families who'd visited the area over the years. Ruth had apparently spent considerable time watching people from her windows, recording their activities, their children's names, even their license plate numbers. The obsessive detail in these notes suggested behavior far beyond casual neighborhood awareness. Jennifer initially dismissed the notes as the harmless eccentricity of a lonely old woman. Ruth Morrison had died 5 years before the Torres family's disappearance, so there couldn't be any connection between her voyeuristic habits and the missing family. Jennifer bundled up the notes and continued with her renovation work. But as she removed more wallpaper throughout the house, Jennifer found additional notes hidden in various locations. Behind the paper in the living room, she discovered Ruth's observations about children playing in nearby yards. In the hallway, she found notes about which families went on vacation and when their houses would be empty. The content of these notes grew increasingly disturbing as Jennifer found more of them. Ruth had recorded details about family arguments she'd overheard, children's school schedules, even intimate moments she'd witnessed through other people's windows. The woman had clearly been conducting surveillance on her neighbors for years, documenting their private lives with meticulous precision. What troubled Jennifer most was the analytical tone of Ruth's writing. These weren't the random observations of a bored retiree, but systematic intelligence gathering. Ruth had been studying families like a scientist examining specimens, looking for patterns and vulnerabilities with cold, calculating interest. Jennifer began to feel uncomfortable living in a house where such invasive surveillance had taken place. She considered abandoning the renovation project, but she'd already invested too much money to walk away. Instead, she decided to document everything she found and turn it over to the sheriff's department once she'd completed her search. The real breakthrough came when Jennifer began working on the second floor. Ruth Morrison's bedroom contained built-in wardrobes along one wall, and when Jennifer opened them to assess their condition, she found they were much deeper than expected. Behind the hanging clothes, a false wall had been constructed, creating a hidden space about 3 feet wide and 8 feet long. The hidden space contained Ruth Morrison's most private possessions. File cabinets lined the walls, filled with folders labeled with family names. Jennifer recognized many of the names as current and former Millfield residents. Each folder contained photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten observations, and what appeared to be personal items that had clearly been stolen from the families. One file was thicker than all the others, labeled simply Torres Family, December 1995. Jennifer's hands shook as she opened it, knowing she was about to uncover information that could finally explain the most famous disappearance in Millfield's history. Inside the Torres file, Jennifer found photographs of the family that had been taken during their stay at Harold Whitmore's cabin. But these weren't vacation photos. They were surveillance images taken with a telephoto lens from a concealed position in the woods. The photos showed Miguel and Carmen preparing meals, the children playing in the snow, intimate family moments that should have been private. But it was the final photograph in the file that made Jennifer's blood run cold. The image showed the Torres family walking into the woods behind their cabin, but they weren't alone. A fifth figure walked beside them, face obscured by shadows and winter clothing. Ruth Morrison had somehow been present during the family's final moments, documenting their last known activities with the same cold precision she'd applied to all her other surveillance targets. Jennifer immediately called Sheriff Hayes, who arrived at the Morrison house within 20 minutes of receiving Jennifer's frantic phone call. The sheriff had heard stories about Ruth Morrison's reclusive nature, but she'd never suspected the elderly woman of criminal behavior. Ruth had died 6 years ago, well before Sheriff Hayes had taken office, so she knew the woman only through second-hand accounts from long-time residents. Together, Jennifer and Sheriff Hayes systematically examined the contents of Ruth Morrison's hidden room. The scope of the woman's surveillance activities was staggering. She'd been watching and documenting her neighbors' lives for at least 20 years, accumulating files on more than 30 families who'd lived in or visited the Millfield area. The files contained evidence of numerous crimes. Ruth had stolen mail, photographed people through their windows, and even entered homes when families were away on vacation. She documented children's routines in ways that would have facilitated kidnapping, and she'd recorded personal information that could have been used for identity theft or blackmail. But the Torres family file was unique in several disturbing ways. Unlike the other files, which contained primarily observational notes and stolen photographs, the Torres file included detailed planning documents. Ruth had written extensive notes about the family's vacation rental, Harold Whitmore's property layout, and the surrounding terrain. Most chilling of all were Ruth's psychological profiles of each family member. She'd analyzed Miguel's personality based on his body language and interactions with his family, concluding that he was protective but naive. She'd described Carmen as trusting to a fault and noted that Sophia was naturally curious and easily manipulated. Her observations about 8-year-old Mateo were particularly disturbing, focusing on his innocence and vulnerability. Sheriff Hayes called in the State Police Crime Scene Unit to process the hidden room. Detective Mark Sullivan, who'd worked on missing persons cases throughout New England, took charge of the investigation. Sullivan later told me that Ruth Morrison's files represented one of the most comprehensive stalking operations he'd ever encountered. The photographs of the Torres family during their final walk into the woods became the focus of intense analysis. Forensic specialists enhanced the images, trying to identify the mysterious fifth figure who'd accompanied the family. The person appeared to be wearing dark winter clothing and a hat that obscured their facial features, making identification impossible. But the body language in the photographs suggested something deeply troubling. The Torres family didn't appear to be walking voluntarily. Their posture and positioning indicated they were being directed or coerced by the unknown figure. Miguel's protective stance near his children and Carmen's visible tension suggested they were aware of danger, but unable to escape it. Detective Sullivan's team found additional evidence in Ruth Morrison's basement. Hidden beneath a workbench, they discovered clothes that matched the description of what the Torres family had been wearing on the day they disappeared. The clothes had been cleaned, but forensic testing revealed traces of blood that matched the family's DNA profiles. The discovery of the family's blood-stained clothing confirmed what everyone had feared, but no one wanted to believe. The Torres family was dead, and Ruth Morrison had been involved in their murders. But significant questions remained unanswered. Ruth Morrison had been a frail, elderly woman in 1995, physically incapable of overpowering 4 people by herself. Detective Sullivan theorized that Ruth had been working with an accomplice, someone younger and stronger who could have physically controlled the family while Ruth documented their final moments. The mysterious fifth figure in the photographs supported this theory, but identifying Ruth's partner proved challenging since the woman had died 6 years earlier. The investigation expanded to include everyone who'd had regular contact with Ruth Morrison during the 1990s. Neighbors recalled seeing a man visiting the Morrison house occasionally, but their descriptions were vague and inconsistent. Some remembered a middle-aged contractor who'd done repair work on the property, while others mentioned a nephew who'd visited during holidays. Ruth Morrison's financial records revealed several large cash deposits made in January 1996, just weeks after the Torres family's disappearance. The deposits totaled nearly $50,000, far more money than an elderly woman on a fixed income should have possessed. The source of this money remained unknown, but it suggested that Ruth might have been paid for her involvement in the family's murder. As news of the discovery spread through Millfield, the community experienced a complex mix of emotions. Many residents felt relief that the mystery had finally been solved, but they also struggled with the realization that a killer had lived among them for years. Ruth Morrison had been their neighbor, someone they'd seen at the grocery store and the post office, never suspecting her capacity for such evil. The revelation that Ruth Morrison had been systematically stalking families for decades created new fears and paranoia. Parents wondered if their own children had been targets of her surveillance. Homeowners questioned whether their privacy had been violated in ways they'd never discovered. The sense of community trust that had already been damaged by the Torres disappearance suffered another devastating blow. Sheriff Hayes organized community meetings to address residents' concerns and provide updates on the ongoing investigation. She assured people that Ruth Morrison was dead and could no longer pose a threat. But many residents remained anxious about the unknown accomplice who might still be living in their community. The months following the discovery of Ruth Morrison's hidden room brought both progress and frustration to the Torres family investigation. Detective Sullivan's team worked tirelessly to identify Ruth's accomplice, but their efforts were hampered by the 6-year gap between Ruth's death and the discovery of her crimes. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Sullivan decided to re-examine the crime scene at Harold Whitmore's cabin. The property had remained largely untouched since the original investigation, and Sullivan hoped that new forensic techniques might reveal evidence that had been missed 11 years earlier. Using ground-penetrating radar, Sullivan's team detected anomalies in the soil about 400 yards from the cabin, in an area that hadn't been thoroughly searched during the original investigation. The location was hidden behind a thick grove of pine trees, invisible from the cabin and accessible only through dense underbrush. On a cold morning in November 2006, the excavation began. What they found beneath 3 feet of Maine soil would finally provide answers to the questions that had haunted Millfield for over a decade. The remains of the Torres family were discovered in a carefully constructed burial site, their bodies arranged with disturbing precision. The condition of the remains and the burial site provided crucial evidence about the circumstances of their deaths. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell determined that the family had been killed execution style, with each victim shot once in the back of the head. The methodical nature of the murders suggested professional expertise or military training. More disturbing was the evidence that the family had been held captive for several days before their deaths. Rope marks on their skeletal remains indicated they'd been bound for extended periods. Analysis of the burial site revealed that their murders had taken place at the location where they were found, not at the cabin as investigators had initially assumed. The discovery of the family's remains brought closure to some aspects of the case, but it also raised new questions about the killer's motives. The Torres family had been ordinary tourists with no connection to criminal activity. They possessed nothing of significant value that would justify such elaborate planning and brutal execution. Detective Sullivan theorized that the murders were connected to Ruth Morrison's voyeuristic obsession with families. Perhaps she and her accomplice had developed a shared fantasy about controlling and ultimately destroying the perfect family units that Ruth had been stalking for years. The Torres family had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming victims of a deranged partnership. Harold Whitmore's reaction to the discovery was particularly heartbreaking. The elderly man had blamed himself for the family's disappearance for 11 years, wondering if he'd somehow failed to protect his tenants. Learning that the family had been murdered by professional killers who'd planned their crime in advance provided some relief from his guilt, but it also confirmed his worst fears about their fate. The media coverage of the remains' discovery was intense but respectful. The story of the Torres family's murder had captivated the public for over a decade, and the resolution of the case attracted national attention. But reporters generally focused on the investigation's progress rather than sensationalizing the family's suffering. Miguel's elderly parents, who'd maintained hope for their son's survival throughout the 11-year ordeal, struggled to accept the finality of the discovery. Carmen's sister Maria told reporters that while the family was grateful to finally have answers, the knowledge that their loved ones had suffered before death made their grief even more difficult to bear. The Torres family was finally laid to rest in December 2006, exactly 11 years after their disappearance. The funeral service was attended by hundreds of Millfield residents who'd never met the family but had been touched by their story. Sheriff Hayes spoke at the service, promising that the investigation would continue until Ruth Morrison's accomplice was identified and brought to justice. But as 2006 turned into 2007, the investigation stalled once again. Despite extensive efforts to identify Ruth's partner, Detective Sullivan's team had found no concrete leads. The mysterious fifth figure in Ruth's photographs remained unidentified, and the case seemed destined to join the ranks of partially solved crimes that frustrated law enforcement and families alike. The community of Millfield began to adapt to this new reality. The Torres family had been found and properly buried, but their killer remained at large. Parents continued to watch their children carefully, and residents remained vigilant about unusual activity in their neighborhood. The fear had evolved from wondering what had happened to the Torres family to wondering who among them might be capable of such horrific crimes. Jennifer Coleman completed her renovation of the Morrison house, but decided to sell the property rather than live there permanently. Despite the removal of Ruth's surveillance equipment and files, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house retained some residual evil from its previous owner's activities. The Morrison house eventually sold to a family from out of state who were unaware of its dark history. Millfield residents chose not to inform them about Ruth Morrison's crimes, reasoning that the new owners deserved a fresh start without the psychological burden of their home's past. But many neighbors kept a watchful eye on the property, subconsciously monitoring it for any signs that its history might somehow repeat itself. By 2008, the Torres family murder case had once again faded from regular public discussion, though it remained an open investigation. Detective Sullivan had been promoted and transferred to another jurisdiction, leaving the case in the hands of Detective Ray Foster, a younger investigator who brought fresh perspective to the 11-year-old crime. Detective Foster decided to approach the case from a different angle, focusing on Ruth Morrison's background rather than searching for her unknown accomplice. He spent months researching her personal history, looking for connections that previous investigators might have missed. Ruth Morrison had lived in Millfield for 37 years, moving to the area in 1958 when she was 25 years old. She'd purchased the Victorian house with money inherited from her parents' estate and had lived there alone until her death in 2001. She'd never married, had no known children, and maintained minimal contact with extended family members. What interested Detective Foster was Ruth's employment history. Before moving to Millfield, she'd worked for a private investigation firm in Boston. Her job involved conducting surveillance on insurance fraud suspects and gathering evidence for divorce proceedings. This background explained her sophisticated surveillance techniques and her access to photographic equipment. The private investigation firm's records revealed that Ruth had been fired in 1957 for ethical violations. She'd been caught stalking subjects beyond the scope of her assigned cases, demonstrating the same voyeuristic behavior that she'd later exhibit in Millfield. Her former supervisor described her as professionally competent but personally disturbed, Detective Foster also discovered that Ruth had maintained correspondence with several individuals throughout her years in Millfield. Most of these were routine business communications, but one pen-pal relationship stood out as potentially significant. Ruth had exchanged letters with a man named David Carver for over 20 years. David Carver lived in Burlington, Vermont, about 3 hours from Millfield. He was a former military sniper who'd served in Vietnam and had struggled with civilian readjustment after his discharge in 1973. Carver had been arrested several times for minor offenses, but had no convictions for violent crimes. The correspondence between Ruth and David revealed a disturbing shared fascination with what they called perfect families. Their letters discussed families they'd observed, analyzing their relationships and speculating about their private lives. The tone of these letters grew increasingly dark over the years, evolving from observation to fantasy about controlling and destroying family units. Detective Foster's investigation revealed that David Carver had visited Millfield at least 6 times between 1990 and 1996. Hotel records confirmed his presence in the area during December 1995, placing him in Millfield at the time of the Torres family's disappearance. But when Detective Foster attempted to locate David Carver for questioning, he discovered that the man had died in 2003, 2 years after Ruth Morrison's death. Carver had suffered a heart attack at age 61, taking any first-hand knowledge of the Torres murders to his grave. However, Carver's death didn't end Detective Foster's investigation. The man's apartment in Burlington had been cleaned out by a nephew who'd stored Carver's belongings in a storage unit. Detective Foster obtained a warrant to search these stored items, hoping to find additional evidence linking Carver to the Torres murders. Among Carver's possessions, Detective Foster found a collection of photographs and personal items that had clearly been taken from the Torres family. Miguel's wallet, Carmen's jewelry, and even some of the children's toys were hidden in a footlocker that also contained Carver's military service records and sniper certification documents. Most damning of all was a handwritten journal that Carver had maintained during his final years. The journal contained detailed accounts of the Torres family murders, written in the clinical style of a military after-action report. Carver described how he and Ruth had surveilled the family, planned their abduction, and executed their plan with methodical precision. According to Carver's journal, the murders had been motivated by Ruth's obsession with destroying what she considered artificially perfect families. She believed that families like the Torres represented a lie about human nature, and that exposing their vulnerability would somehow validate her own isolated existence. Carver had been drawn to Ruth's philosophy because it provided justification for the violence he'd been trained to perform but couldn't express in civilian life. Their partnership allowed him to use his military skills while serving what he considered a higher purpose, revealing the fragility of domestic happiness. The journal entries describing the actual murders were written with disturbing detachment. Carver noted the family's reactions, their attempts to protect each other, and their final moments with the clinical precision of a research scientist. He showed no remorse for their suffering, viewing their deaths as necessary sacrifices to prove his and Ruth's twisted worldview. Detective Foster's discovery of Carver's journal finally provided complete closure to the Torres family murder case. Both killers were dead, eliminating any possibility of prosecution, but the families of the victims could finally understand exactly what had happened to their loved ones and why. The revelation that the murders had been motivated by jealousy of family happiness added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case. The Torres family had been killed not for money or personal vendettas, but because their very existence as a loving family unit had somehow offended 2 deeply disturbed individuals. The final resolution of the Torres family murder case brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to Millfield's residents. Sheriff Hayes held a press conference in March 2009 to announce that the case was officially closed, with both perpetrators identified and their methods fully understood. The community response was complex and emotional. Many residents expressed gratitude that the mystery had finally been solved completely, but others struggled with the knowledge that such evil had existed in their midst for so many years. The revelation that Ruth Morrison and David Carver had been motivated by hatred of family happiness struck particularly close to home for parents and couples in Millfield. Harold Whitmore attended the press conference, his first public appearance since the discovery of the family's remains. Now 87 years old and frail, he listened with tears in his eyes as Sheriff Hayes read excerpts from Carver's journal. When reporters asked for his reaction, Harold simply said, "Those poor babies didn't deserve any of this." Jennifer Coleman, who'd discovered Ruth Morrison's hidden room, also attended the press conference. She told reporters that while she was glad to have played a role in solving the case, she sometimes wished she'd never bought the Morrison house. The knowledge of what had happened there continued to haunt her, even though she'd sold the property and moved to another state. The Torres family's relatives expressed gratitude for Detective Foster's persistence in solving the case completely. Maria, Carmen's sister, stated that knowing the truth about her family's final days was painful but necessary for their healing process. She announced plans to establish a scholarship fund in honor of Sophia and Mateo, hoping to create something positive from their tragic deaths. The case's resolution also brought unexpected revelations about other families who'd been targeted by Ruth Morrison and David Carver. Detective Foster's investigation of Carver's possessions revealed evidence that the pair had stalked at least a dozen other families over the years, though the Torres family appeared to be their only murder victims. Several families who'd lived in Millfield during the 1990s came forward with stories of feeling watched or experiencing minor thefts that they'd never reported to police. A couple who'd lived near Ruth Morrison recalled finding their garbage scattered in unusual patterns, which they now realized had been signs of systematic surveillance. The psychological impact on these families was significant. Learning that they'd been targets of the same killers who'd murdered the Torres family created new trauma for people who'd thought they were safe. Some sought counseling to deal with the retroactive fear of what might have happened to them. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the psychologist who documented the community's collective trauma following the original disappearance, noted that the case's resolution created a different type of psychological challenge. Instead of dealing with uncertainty and fear of the unknown, residents now had to confront the specific knowledge of evil that had lived among them. The Millfield Town Council voted to purchase Harold Whitmore's property, including the cabin where the Torres family had stayed. They planned to convert the land into a memorial park, honoring the family and other victims of violence. Harold donated the property for a symbolic $1, saying he was grateful to finally be rid of a place that had brought him so much pain. The Memorial Park project became a community healing initiative. Residents volunteered their time and resources to create a peaceful space where families could gather and children could play safely. The park included a memorial plaque listing the names of Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and Mateo Torres, along with a message about the importance of protecting innocence and family bonds. The old Morrison house proved more challenging to deal with. Despite being sold to an unsuspecting family, rumors about its history eventually reached the new owners. They decided to sell the property again, struggling to find buyers who were willing to live in a house associated with such dark history. Eventually, a local developer purchased the Morrison house with plans to demolish it and build condominiums on the lot. Many residents supported this decision, feeling that the house itself had been contaminated by Ruth Morrison's crimes. Others argued for historical preservation, believing that destroying the house would somehow diminish the memory of the Torres family. The demolition took place in the summer of 2010, nearly 15 years after the Torres family's murder. A small crowd gathered to watch as the Victorian house was reduced to rubble. Some residents felt that the destruction of Ruth Morrison's home represented a final victory over the evil she'd represented. But as the debris was cleared away, workers made one last disturbing discovery. Hidden beneath the house's foundation, they found additional evidence of Ruth Morrison's surveillance activities. Hundreds of photographs and personal items stolen from families over the decades, preserved in waterproof containers like a time capsule of violation and intrusion. The discovery beneath the Morrison House Foundation revealed the true scope of Ruth Morrison's lifetime obsession with surveillance and stalking. The waterproof containers held evidence of crimes spanning nearly 4 decades, documenting her voyeuristic activities from her early days in Millfield through the final years before her death. Detective Foster spent months cataloging the newly discovered evidence. The photographs showed families at their most vulnerable moments, children playing in backyards, couples arguing through kitchen windows, teenagers kissing on front porches. Ruth had captured thousands of private moments that were never meant to be seen by outsiders' eyes. Among the most disturbing items were what appeared to be practice photographs, images Ruth had taken to test angles and lighting for optimal surveillance. These photos showed her progression from amateur voyeur to sophisticated stalker, developing techniques that would eventually enable her partnership with David Carver in the Torres family murders. The stolen personal items created a museum of violation. Children's toys, family photographs, pieces of clothing, and personal documents represented decades of theft from unsuspecting families. Each item was carefully labeled with dates and locations, revealing the methodical nature of Ruth's criminal activity. Detective Foster's analysis revealed that Ruth Morrison had been escalating her criminal behavior over the years. What started as simple voyeurism in the 1960s had gradually evolved into theft, then to active surveillance planning, and finally to partnership in murder. The Torres family had been the culmination of a lifetime of building criminal expertise. The discovery also revealed that Ruth had maintained detailed profiles on families who'd moved away from Millfield years earlier. She'd tracked some of these families to their new locations, suggesting that her surveillance network extended far beyond the local community. Several families from other states were contacted and informed that they'd been victims of her stalking activities. As news of the final discovery spread, it created a new wave of anxiety among former Millfield residents. People who'd lived in the area decades earlier began to wonder if they'd been targets of Ruth Morrison's surveillance. Some requested copies of Detective Foster's findings to determine if their families had been victimized. The psychological impact on current residents was equally significant. The knowledge that Ruth Morrison had been documenting their community's private lives for nearly 40 years created a sense of retroactive violation that was difficult to process. Many people felt as though their entire lives in Millfield had been lived under invisible scrutiny. Sheriff Hayes made the decision to destroy most of the newly discovered evidence after documenting it for investigative purposes. She felt that preserving thousands of photographs and stolen personal items would only perpetuate the violation that Ruth Morrison had inflicted on innocent families. The evidence was cremated in a private ceremony attended only by law enforcement officials. The Torres family case officially closed with the destruction of the final evidence in November 2010, exactly 15 years after the family's disappearance. Sheriff Hayes announced that all aspects of the investigation had been completed and that no further discoveries were anticipated. But the impact of the case on Millfield would continue for years to come. The Torres family murders had revealed vulnerabilities in community safety that residents had never considered. The knowledge that predators could live among them undetected for decades changed how people thought about their neighbors and their own security. The memorial park honoring the Torres family was completed in the spring of 2011. The peaceful space included playground equipment, walking trails, and benches where families could gather safely. A small garden near the memorial plaque was planted with flowers that bloomed year-round, ensuring that the Torres family would be remembered in every season. Harold Whitmore lived to see the memorial park's completion, passing away peacefully in his sleep just 3 months after its dedication. His obituary noted his role in the Torres family case and his lifelong commitment to helping others, despite the tragedy that had defined his final years. Jennifer Coleman never returned to Millfield after selling the Morrison house, but she maintained correspondence with Sheriff Hayes and other residents who'd been involved in solving the case. She established a foundation that provided support for communities dealing with unsolved crimes, hoping to help other families find the closure that had eventually come to the Torres case. The case also led to changes in law enforcement procedures for missing persons investigations. Detective Foster developed new protocols for examining cold cases, emphasizing the importance of thoroughly investigating seemingly unrelated individuals who might have had access to victims. His techniques were adopted by police departments throughout New England. As the years passed, the Torres family murders became part of Millfield's permanent history, a reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist in any community. But the case also demonstrated the power of persistence, community support, and the human desire for justice and truth. The story of Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and Mateo Torres continues to resonate with people far beyond Millfield. Their tragic fate serves as a reminder to cherish family bonds and to remain vigilant about the safety of those we love. Though their lives were cut short by senseless violence, their memory lives on in the hearts of those who fought to find them and in the lessons their case taught about the importance of never giving up hope for answers. What do you think really happened during those final moments in the woods? The journal entries tell us the facts, but they can't capture the fear and love that the Torres family must have shared in their last hours together. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this case affected you, like it affected me, make sure to subscribe for more deep investigations into cases that changed entire communities forever.